Now, one of the biggest problems that we've had historically when the selection of the state course code is made is number one, CalPADS administrators were expected to kind of make the mapping from a local course to the state course code. And I will tell you right now that that is absolutely going to result in exceptions in CalSAAS. So it's always best that your curriculum and instruction staff review the appropriate state course code and make the selection before populating it in your student information system. And here are the considerations that you need to make. First, you need to determine the content of the course. Okay, so if you look at the course description and it's, the course is titled Fun with Math, then generally it's going to be a math course. So that would probably steer you to the section of our course codes that are math courses. Secondly, standards. That is probably the most important thing. What were the standards used to develop the content of the course? We run into this with media arts courses, and we run into it with career technical education courses. Okay, so if a course was developed with the media arts standards, you should choose the media arts code rather than choosing a career technical education code, because the credentialing requirements are very, very different. If a course was developed with the CTE standards, it's a CTE course. What should not drive it is the teacher's credential and what the teacher's authorized to teach. That is super important. A course is a course, and the state course code should be collected or selected based on the standards that were used to develop the course. One of the other considerations also in terms of the way our course codes are structured is what are the grade level standards that are being taught. Sometimes we have codes that are specific to the elementary grades, and then we also have codes that are specific to middle and high school. So those are some considerations that you need to make. But again, the curriculum and instruction staff in your district should be taking the lead on that. Other ways to avoid exceptions in CalSAAS. One of the primary reasons that you guys got exceptions this year, based on some initial data analysis that the CTC did, was you were not populating the local assignment options in your student information system and in CalSAAS. So credential analysts, those of you on the credentialing side of the house, it is really important if you have educators annually that are on local assignment options, you need to provide that information to your student information system or CalPADS coordinator so that they can get that information into the student information system so that it gets reported up to CalPADS. If you don't do that, you're going to have to work the exception in CalSAAS. So we're trying to give you options so that you don't generate those exceptions. Next, you want to make sure that you identify any middle school courses that are being taught through a middle school course setting. Again, we're collecting this information on the course section record in your student information systems and in CalPADS. In CalPADS, it's field 9.34 middle school course setting indicator. It's just a yes/no field. So what's really important is that in your student information system, if you have middle school teachers that are teaching in a departmentalized fashion, you need to identify on each of that teacher's sections which courses are part of that teacher's core setting, including the hanging fifth period. So CTC has provided a training module specifically on middle school core. It's really complicated, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail about it today, but I urge you, if you have not looked at this, to take this particular training.
Okay, so I'll kind of briefly go over the middle school core setting. Basically, the middle school core setting occurs in grades 5 through 8 only, when a teacher is assigned on the basis of a credential that authorizes service in a self-contained classroom. So that could be a multiple subject teaching credential. And they teach 2 or more subjects to the same group of students in the same day, and the student group remains the same. So this mimics a departmentalized setting, but it is still self-contained, and therefore it requires a credential authorizing instruction in a self-contained setting, such as a multiple subject teaching credential. Core assignments can also allow for educators to be assigned a hanging period, which allows the educator to teach one of the subjects that's already being taught in their core assignment. So for a hanging period to be part of a correct core assignment, the extra period must be in one of the exact same subjects and grade levels already being taught in one of the core assignments. And it cannot constitute more than half of the teacher's total assignment. So that's kind of a brief overview, but I would also recommend, like Brandy said, to review the self-contained assignment school module that was linked on the previous slide, and it does provide more in-depth scenarios and such. Now, here's an example of a CalPADS code exception in CalSAAS. So this exception was generated because the educator reported in the assignment does not hold the appropriate authorization to teach the CalPADS state course code of 9322. So you can find this information by referring to the exception type, which states CalPADS code, and the exception value, which states 9322.
Okay, so what you want to do is for this particular exception, remember, you're looking at the exception value, which in this case is a state course code. So you want to look up the description of course code 9322, which in this case happens to be the life sciences code. So you want to look at that description. Then the second thing is, as we pointed out earlier, is then you want to go back to your master course catalog to verify that this particular course actually is representative of what we describe at the state level as life science. In this case, it looks like that was the appropriate selection, 9322.
So then you'll want to check the authorizations the educator held on census date. And to view these, you'll simply open the details of the exception, and the credential information section has a link for the educator authorization. You can see there in the red box. Again, this will only list documents that were valid on census date. So for example, if an educator's document expired the day before census date and was renewed the day after census date, then it will not be listed within CalSAAS. So to view all of the educator's documents, including expired documents, you can use the link here in the blue to get a fuller picture of what the educator has held.
Okay, so basically if you checked, so for the core example, if you clicked on this educator's authorization, and they held a multiple subject teaching credential that authorizes self-contained, service in self-contained classroom. I think that's what we're getting at with this particular slide.
Right, and I was just going to say, for the sake of argument, because this is a scenario, just let's make the assumption that this teacher actually holds a multiple subject credential. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is you want to review that teacher's middle school core settings. So this particular teacher is teaching what looks to be a middle school core. So they're teaching math and science, 7th grade math and science to group A, 7th grade math and science to group B. And then they've got a hanging 5th period, which is they can teach either of the subjects that they're coring to a separate group of kids as long as it's at the same grade level. That's typically called a hanging 5th. And this particular teacher, again, let's assume that they have a multiple subject credential and they are coring these subjects, and they've got a hanging 5th period of 7th grade science. So then what you want to do, because remember, you're looking at data that you've already certified in CalPADS, is you want to look in report 4.3, and we're going to go into this in a little more detail later on in the presentation. So 4.3 is the staff teaching assignment detail, and you want to verify that the middle school course setting indicator for this particular educator and those sections of science have the middle school course settings set to yes. Okay, so if those middle school course settings had been set to yes for all of the subjects that the teacher is scoring, then it's very possible that it would not have generated an exception in CalSAAS. So the monitoring authority determines that the LEA forgot to mark the courses as part of a course setting. So in this case, the determination that the monitoring authority would make is a course setting determination. See, here's the key, folks. Again, the determination has to be made in CalSAAS. You can't go back to the data you've already certified and change it to make it correct. Now, if the educator remains in this same setting for the following year, then it's really important that you go in to your student information system for this year and identify all of those courses that are part of that course setting. Okay, so the second CalSAAS exception type is special education exception. This did cause some grief for a lot of people. And so I just want to explain really briefly what this means when you get this exception. So in this case, the course was identified as a course where all students enrolled are students with disabilities, otherwise known as a special day class. Okay, so a special day class is essentially a course where all students enrolled are students with disabilities, and the course was designed specifically for students with disabilities. In CalPADS, you represent special day classes by populating an instructional strategy code of 700 special education. But in this case, this exception was generated because the teacher does not hold the appropriate special education credential or authorizations to provide students with certain primary disabilities that are in that classroom, okay?
Yeah, so if you come across a special education exception type, you'll need the following information. The course information, such as if the class is a special day class. So you'll need the class roster. You'll need to know the students in the class and what their primary disabilities are. As well, you will likely need to know the student's IEP information. You will want to know the educator's valid credentials and authorizations on census date so you can compare the two. So this is a special education exception. You can see that based on the exception type here, it says special education. Like Randy said, this means that the course was reported with the special education instructional strategy in CalPADS, which is 700. Now take a look at the exception value. So the exception value here is autism. So that indicates that at least one student in the class has a primary disability of autism, and that the educator assigned to the course does not hold the appropriate authorization to teach students with the primary disability of autism. So again, the exception type states special education, meaning that it was reported as a special education instructional strategy in CalPADS of 700, and the exception value is the students in the class, at least one has a primary disability of autism. So here are some things to consider when reviewing special education exceptions. Is the educator assigned to the course teaching a special education class, which consists of only students with disabilities? If not, then, and the educator is instead teaching a general education class, then it's possible that this is a CalPADS error. You'd need to look into that. If you, let's see, you'll want to review the teacher's authorizations to see if they hold an appropriate special education authorization to provide instruction and related services to students with the primary disability that's listed on the exception. If they do, then you'll want to check if the document was valid on census date. If the document was issued after census date, but prior to monitoring in CalSAAS, then it's possible it could be a corrected misassignment. If the educator did not hold an appropriate authorization for the student's primary disability area, then you may want to look into if the student was placed in the class on the basis of their IEP's direction. It's possible that this could be an alternate special education placement, or it could be a misassignment. So further information related to the alternate SPED placement can be found within the CalSAAS resources that are linked on slide 17. But as always, questions related to specific exceptions should really be addressed with your monitoring authority to ensure that all the details are discussed. Now, if the assignments are reported accurately in CalPADS, it will reduce the number of exceptions produced in CalSAAS unnecessarily. And based on the number of CalPADS errors that we saw this year, I do believe, in the subsequent years, we will see a reduction in that. It's really important that the instructional strategy is reported accurately in CalPADS, because CalSAAS is coded to process general education assignments differently than special education assignments. So assignments reported with instructional strategy 700, CalSAAS will check for the appropriate special education authorization to cover that student's primary disability areas, rather than checking the authorizations for alignment with the general education course assignment. So additionally, it's important to note that local assignment options cannot be used in special education programs. So the local assignment option determination would not be appropriate, as well as the course setting and the 1920 charter determinations. Those do not apply to special education exceptions and would not be an appropriate determination to select for them.
Okay, so here's a sample scenario. So in this case, for our special education exception, it was generated on a self-contained course for a student with a primary disability of autism. So you're looking in the exception value. So anytime you have special education exception, the exception value is generally going to be a primary disability for which that teacher is not appropriately authorized. Okay, so the first thing that you need to ask is, number one, is this course actually a special day class? What we found is people are using that special education instructional strategy of 700 in CalPADS incorrectly sometimes. Okay, so if it is not a special day class, again, where all the kids are students with disabilities and the course was specifically designed for students with disabilities, then do not use code 700 on that course. Okay, if it is actually a special day class, then what you want to do is beginning this year, you want to review report 3.8, which is course section enrollment student list, to see which of the students in that particular class has a primary disability of autism. Okay, because in this case, the student that is generating this exception, or there may be a couple students that could be generating this exception, you'll have to look into a little bit more detail about these specific students. If the course is not actually a special day class, then the monitoring authority is generally going to make a determination of CalPADS error, because that class should never have been coded 700 in the first place.
Okay, and what we saw, we've been talking about an autism example. And, there are, as you can see from this chart, a few different special education credential authorizations that are able to serve students with autism. I'm not going to go into which ones here. I just want to, again, make sure you know that you have resources to help you out. Right there at that link, you can find this chart and many other resources. And of course, as usual, you can always confer with your monitoring authority. Okay. So I want to touch on the alternate SPED determination one more time. So special education exceptions are the only ones that can get the alternate SPED determination. So if the teacher does not have the appropriate authorizations, you can confirm with the special education case manager whether or not the student was placed in the course based on their IEP, either based on their secondary disability area, because CalSAAS doesn't monitor for that, or based on being in the least restrictive environment. If that is the case, the monitoring authority could make a determination of alternate SPED placement when they see this exception. However, if this does happen, the student really needs to be getting the services required by the IEP through pull-in or push-out or some other method, that I'm not aware of, but they need to be getting those services if they are identified. If no, then this would be a misassignment. Okay, so here is our last type of exception, and that is the English learner exception. And these occur when an educator is not authorized for the EL services provided in the classroom. And you're going to need to know the following when you determine this type of exception. You're going to need to know the education services reported for the teacher on report 4.3. You're going to also need information on what English learner services are actually being provided in the course. And then you're going to need to know the teacher's English learner authorization. And this one, it's going to say English learner in the exception type, and then it's going to list basically the education service, value in the exception value as well. It's going to, in most cases, match exactly what's in CalPADS. This one is integrated ELD only.
Okay, so when you're looking at report 4.3, teaching assignment detail, the column that you want to look at is called education service. So every course that a teacher is teaching and the services that were reported as being provided by the teacher to all English learners in that class are generally listed in the education service column. So you want to review that to determine which services were reported and whether or not it's actually correct. Remember, there's some consultation that you probably have to make with your bilingual coordinators, the teacher themselves, your administrators, to determine what's actually occurring in the course. So these are generally the different types of English learner services that are being provided. So Code 1 is primary language instruction, designated and integrated ELD. Keep in mind that anytime you use this particular code, it's going to require a bilingual authorization in the target language. So what is the target language? If you have English learners in that class and they have a primary language of Spanish, for example, then that primary language is what the teacher should hold a bilingual authorization in. Okay, so it does follow the primary language of the student. Codes 2, 3, and 4 also have very specific requirements. So when you're looking to make sure what services are being provided by a teacher to the English learners in their classrooms, you need to read these descriptions to see which of these actually best describes the services that the teacher is actually providing within that either self-contained or departmentalized course.
Okay. And so for this right here, we're just including it to show you again that we have resources to help you with this. And this one is in the AAM. So note that CDE and CTC have different language here. So especially designed academic instruction, or SEDI, that is equivalent to integrated ELD. And ELD within the content, that is equivalent to designated ELD. And then departmentalized means, on our end, a departmentalized course dedicated to only ELD instruction. Also, we know people are having a little bit of trouble with this one, and I think we have another assignment school module coming out to kind of explain the intricacies here, so stay tuned for that as well. So how should you address your English learner exceptions? Well, again, you have to ask, is the teacher actually providing the services identified in report 4.3? If no, the determination could be a CalPADS error, but again, if the educator has, the educator has to be appropriately assigned in real life, just like in those, CalPADS exceptions before. So if they're misassigned in real life, even if it's reported incorrectly in CalPADS, it needs to be noted as a misassignment. So what if the teacher does hold the appropriate EL authorization to provide the service? Well, then you have to, again, look at that census date. Was the authorization, in force on census date? And if it was, it could be an appropriate assignment. And we did see a lot of these with the unregistered CCSDs. I hope you guys have seen that we are collecting these, really looking forward to, taking these all and loading them into the system. We think it's going to clear quite a few exceptions, so stay tuned for that as well. However, if the authorization was not effective on census date, the determination could be a corrected misassignment if, again, it was, in force before monitoring began. And then if no, none of these things, then it could be a misassignment. Okay, and we actually covered this in the last slide, but this is a good place to just point out again that there are not many determinations available for this kind of exception. No LAO, local assignment option determination, and no charter school leeway. This is really important because we saw a lot of these in the data for 1920. Okay, and so ways to avoid generating an English learner exception. Well, you can ensure the course sections are only populated with English learner services that are actually being provided. For example, if no English learner services are being provided, you can select 5 no English learner services, and we're not going to evaluate for any. So that's an important one. And also ensure the teacher's authorizations are effective on census date. I think that's kind of a theme here. We saw a lot of these. Always keep that in mind when you see an exception. And then also ensure teachers teaching a departmentalized ELD class, state course code 9104, English language development, are appropriately authorized. And educators need a full English learner authorization or a bilingual authorization to teach this course. We have lesser authorizations that do not cover it. And here are the most common EL authorizations and documents that are able, and the services they're able to provide. And again, this is just so you have a resource here, and there's the link. I heard a lot of people found this resource very helpful. But before we move on, let me draw your attention to that little 2 at the bottom right corner on that last square. And that says that authorizations, bilingual authorizations, again, must be issued in the target language. For example, a Spanish bilingual authorization needs to be issued for the assignment to be appropriate in a bilingual Spanish classroom.
Okay, so let's look at our scenario. So in this case, we've got an exception that generated on designated and integrated ELD with primary language instruction for a self-contained class. So in this case, the LEA reported designated and integrated ELD with primary language instruction on this particular class, and it generated an exception. So again, what you want to do is look at report 4.3 and verify that in fact, that is the course that generated the exception. You want to pay close attention to the type of course it is. In this case, it's a self-contained 3rd grade class in which primary language and designated and integrated ELD are occurring. So as we said before, if you're telling us that primary language instruction is occurring in this class and being delivered to the English learners, then this expectation is that CTC is going to, that the educator is going to hold a bilingual authorization in that student's primary language.
Yeah, and we have an additional check on that. So, we scan for the language of instruction as well as the bilingual authorization. So again, this chart is, we just want to draw your attention to the bilingual instruction column at the end. There are less options here, and all of them have asterisks in the authorization code as placeholders for the target language. So I just want you again to note that they have to be issued in the target language for the assignment to be appropriate.
Okay. I should also note that because we're getting lots of questions, does every teacher have to have an EL authorization? So if you have English learners in your classroom, then generally you were required to provide them services, right? They have a right under Title III to services. However, we do know that there are cases where there are no English learners enrolled in a course. That's rare in California, but it does happen. If there are no English learners enrolled in the course on Information Day, then you don't have to tell us that they're providing a service because they're not, right? You would indicate that they are not providing services in that case.
And then just to drive the bilingual instruction point home, this is just a little scenario, if an educator is giving bilingual instruction to Spanish students, but they hold, say a bilingual Mandarin authorization, not bilingual Spanish, it would be an exception. It can't be just a bilingual authorization. It has to be in the target language.